Today we are talking about what was once the most popular by far spec in the beta and even in the alpha of Midnight. This was the more popular by like 50, 60, 70% more, but over time, over the last few weeks, we could say perhaps the flavor of the month element has started to taper down a bit more, and now the spec has been passed by quite a few others. We're still talking about one of the more popular overall, but not nearly as much as before. We are talking, of course, obviously about the new spec of the expansion, Devourer Demon Hunter. Now, there was, and there still is, some tension around the release of this spec, because Blizzard is known for releasing a new spec in a pretty overpowered state. You know, the classic, making sure that players play the spec, they make it pretty OP. We have seen this with things like Evokers being released. Preservation was the best healer during its release. You had then, of course, Augmentation Evoker, which was an abomination. If you played much further back, you had spec releases like Demon Hunter, like Havoc Demon Hunter, or even worse, things like Monks when they were released in Mist of Pandaria. So there was the chance and still the worry that this spec was going to come out completely broken. For now, at least, the spec has been remarkably middling, even below average actually. It's nothing special if we're talking about damage, if we're talking about performance, both in the raid and in single target and in Mythic Plus results right now. Devourer is okay. If we were forced, gun to our heads to draw up a meta for the next Mythic Plus season, Devourer wouldn't even be in the first 10 considerations of specs for DPS to make it in a Mythic Plus group. So how does the spec work? Because, you know, when you talk about Demon Hunter, there has been the meme for many years that Havoc Demon Hunter, for example, was a brain-dead 2-button spec. Very simple, very straightforward. Blizzard did this on purpose because it was the new spec. It was gathering to all the edgy kids wanting to roleplay Illidan, so they made the spec some rule of cool, very flashy, very stylish kind of spec. It was an aura farming spec, essentially. But over time, Havoc has become a pretty complicated spec compared to what it was when it was released many years ago. So it's kind of fitting that Devourer is now being released to take its place, because it is a very straightforward and a very simple spec. As you can see from the gameplay right here, all of the damage buttons you are using are condensed in the bottom left, and the buttons are like 5 buttons you are pressing. So Devourer has 2 very distinct goals. One is to grow and one is to be sucked. That's because when you're not in your cooldowns, which is your metamorphosis, cold void metamorphosis, who could have guessed what this ability was? When you're not in void metamorphosis, your goal is to build up your fury to get to 100, because 100 is the fury needed for you to cast Void Ray, which you might guess it's Eye Beam. Except, unlike your Havoc Demon Hunter's Eye Beam, which was somewhat of a special occasion, it happens every 20 seconds, maybe every 30 seconds, even if you're playing Vengeance Demon Hunter with your Fel Devastation, it's not something you use very often. In the case of Devourer, you do. It is one of your most pressed buttons. You do press it quite often. It is usually should be around your second most pressed button. That's because it is relatively easy to get up to 100 Fury to be able to cast this, especially in AoE. Now, if you're not aware of this, the majority of your Fury and the majority of your Soul Fragments as well will be generated by your passive, your Shatter Souls. Very simply, doing damage to enemies have a chance to shatter a Soul Fragment, which is simultaneously a Soul Fragment stack and Fury generation. Now, what makes this very good in AoE is that you have a button called Reap. Now, Reap does nothing. It synergizes with nothing, it procs nothing, it activates nothing. It's not really a setup button you have to remember or remind yourself to press for your rotation. It's purely there to suck up souls around you. This becomes even better because after you Void Ray, because you have Moment of Craving, you can suck up to 6 more souls than the 4 original this can suck up. So it's a 10 soul absorb total. Every soul fragment is 4 fury, so if you suck up 10 of them, it's 40 fury generated in a single button. And this will happen all the time, by the way, in AoE. Because you have a chance to spawn fragments based on your damage hits, Void Ray in AoE, of course, hits everything. Takes damage on everyone, so you have tons of spawns of these fragments on multiple targets, so you will always get to 10 plus soul fragments before you get to suck them all up with this empowered reap. So you get into this flow outside of your cooldown, which looks something like this. It will look like you have just used your I-beam, your Void Ray. You are down now to 0 Fury. You have the talent to give you 10 Fury once you end channeling your Void Ray. You have the talent to give yourself 10 Fury when you cast Reap, and then because you cast Reap empowered by Void Ray, sucking up 10 souls, you already are at 10, 20, 60 Fury. At which point all you need to do is cast 4 Consumes, your spammable ability, which generates 1 soul fragment at least, and then 10 Fury, and you already are at 100 again. At which point you repeat the cycle. You I-beam again, you reap again, you cast however many few consumes you have left to reach 100, so you can I-beam again. And in Mythic class, as mentioned, in multiple targets this will be much faster. In some cases you won't even need to cast your consumes in between I-beams, because you are flooding with so much fury from other tools in your kit, other free fury elements in your kit. Because, for example, as you're draining your I-beam, you might already have been at cap souls, and I-beam keeps spawning these extra souls, and as you know, if you are over the cap, you just absorb them instantly, which is still 4 fury absorbed instantly. So you won't even end at 0 fury, you might end at like 20, 30, 40 fury at the end of I-beam. And then you suck the remaining 10 souls up with Reap, so you're already at 80 fury. So you get these situations where you can happen to be casting Void Ray very often, much more closer to each other. You know, you have instances like these, for example, where in some 20-ish second windows you are casting 4 to 5 Void Rays. So it's like 1 every 5 seconds. And don't forget, Void Ray itself takes like 3 seconds to channel. So it's a lot of Void Ray casts. Now, I said it's an up and down, one where you build and one where you get sucked, because when you enter Void Metamorphosis, the opposite is going to happen. The opposite, where now you are in a Breath of Sindragosa situation, you are in a Surrender to Madness situation. Instead, now it's your Fury that starts being drained as you enter Void Metamorphosis. Void Metamorphosis will enhance your abilities, both your Consume and your Reap. Your Fury will be draining over time. Some of your abilities will very greatly slow the drain, like when you're busy stuck Void Raying people, your Fury drain will be very, very slowed. When you're using the massive AoE Collapsing Star that gets enabled by entering Metamorphosis, your draining will also be very, very slowed. And your game now is to try to stay up. Stay up in Fury as much as you can, because being in Metamorphosis is what allows you to be casting Collapsing Star, which is the new main feature of the spec, which is also what the entire Apex talent is going to revolve around. The Apex talent is giving guaranteed crit to your Collapsing Star. It's also giving the ability itself more damage based on your crit chance. Since it's guaranteed to crit, your crit chance is irrelevant. Now instead your crit chance is turned into more damage for the spell, and then entering Void Metamorphosis makes this ability instantly usable. Because the caveat of being able to use Collapsing Star is generating 30 soul fragments. So you need 50 soul fragments to enter Metamorphosis. That's the first main thing. It's not gated by a cooldown, it's not gated by a timer, it's gated by how many soul fragments you are generating. And in many cases this can mean roughly, because as we said, there is no proper timer, but roughly a 1 minute cooldown, basically, of the ability. And then as soon as you enter meta, you have the free cast of Collapsing Star, and then you have to start building up to 30 soul fragments to cast Collapsing Star again. The difference is that as soon as you enter Metamorphosis, instead of being based on Fury, because of course it would be dumb to be draining your Fury normally inside of meta and then you I-beam to drain even more Fury. Instead, when you enter Void Metamorphosis, you have your normal draining of Fury from the ability, and I-beam will no longer drain your Fury. Instead, now the gating for casting the ability is just a simple cooldown. Now there is a slight downside to this ability, because when you're playing normally, when you're pressing normal buttons, it will be of course even more visible in AoE or multi-target AoE. You will enter these situations where you can I-beam, and then you can, as mentioned, pick up all of them, and then you're already at 82 Fury. So it's just 2 casts before you can I-beam again. So you do have these open buttons where it makes it easier for you to cast I-beam, as we mentioned, within a few seconds of each other. But when you enter meta and I-beam gets into a cooldown, you sort of end up, you know, somewhat starved of buttons, because you enter meta, you get your first collapsing star, you cast your first I-beam, and then you suck up your souls, but then you have a cooldown. So you don't really have anything to do until either A, you get 30 fragments for collapsing star, or the cooldown of I-beam comes back. Otherwise, for example, right now you're stuck spamming your upgraded consume until you actually get cooldowns back. So you have this bizarre situation where actually entering your cooldown makes you somewhat slower, makes you have fewer buttons, or the play slows down a bit, because you don't have a nearly as spammable I-beam as before, because now it has a cooldown. But that is the basis of the spec. You use consume to generate fury, you use reap to suck up, to consume all of these souls spread around you to gain a lot of fury, and then when you have the fury, you spend it with void ray. Once you enter meta, instead the fury is being drained away from you slowly. Your goal is to gain as much fury as you can, to last inside of meta as much as possible, to have as many casts of collapsing star as possible. So you have this weaving in and out situation where in one case you want to build the fury for I-beam, in the other case fury is being drained away from you and you want to try to stay in metamorphosis. You don't really have any other options. As mentioned, your Immolation Aura is just there to give you some fury over time, and these are just all of the buttons you have. Talking about your talents, besides just your Apex talents, you don't have, for starters, really that many options in the divide between AoE and single target. The only major change between AoE and single target is to not use Eradicate, simply because this turns your empowered Reap after Void Ray into an AoE ability. But obviously, being in a single target boss fight, you wouldn't need this. The only main option at the moment is the choice of your Fury generation, because you can choose, for example, to be playing with the Reap now generates 10 Fury, and the Reap now gains an additional charge. Or the opposite, which is to make your Feast of Souls last 4 more seconds. This is good because Feast of Souls is what gives you 1% more damage per soul fragment consumed. This can go up very often, will go up very often in Mythic class to 15% more damage, up to 20% more damage. So making this last 4 more seconds is pretty good, is pretty valuable. And you know, you will learn over time that there is really no need playing with a second charge of Reap. The very simple fact of this is that, as we said, the only purpose, the only use of your Reap is to suck up all of these spawned souls. So if we already know, if you're already aware that we want to use this Mega Suck after I-beam, but at the same time I-beam resets the cooldown of Reap, then all we do is just I-beam into free proc and suck them up. And then just do it again. You don't need to cast it in between. You just, even if it's on cooldown, you just I-beam, you will get your reset of your Reap ability empowered to suck them all up, right? So you don't really need the second charge, pretty much, when you're playing. And then I guess you will learn to live without the 10 extra fury of Reap, if it means you can have a 10-second long Feast of Soul. The other option was the 10 extra fury after Void Ray ends. Generally, you get to pick this or the extra 10% damage on your Void Ray, one of these two, as an option. There is the dark side of Devour at the moment, which is a unused, not just unused set of talents, but also unused set of hero talents. We're talking about Void Scarred, because right now Void Scarred plays around this entire line of talents, because something we haven't mentioned yet is the fact that you still have in your toolkit Voidblade, or, Felblade. Because this set of talents gives a follow-up button to your Voidblade called Hungering Slash, and then it gives you more Voidblade and Hungering Slash damage. It gives you Collapsing Star, your mega spell, reducing the cooldown of Voidblade, and then Voidblade and the Hunt, reducing the Fury Drain inside of meta, and then the Hunt. What makes this good is the fact that when you play Void Scarred, meta empowers Voidblade and Hungering Slash. So already by default, if you want to play Void Scarred, you have to play down this line. Then, following up, you also have entering meta resets the cooldown of Voidblade and the Hunt. So even though the Hunt reads as having a 1.5 minute cooldown, which is pretty big, the fact is that you can prep your meta, for example, by using the Hunt and then using your Hungering Slash into Voidblade, into Hungering Slash, and then as you enter meta, you reset the cooldown of the ability. So it's a much, essentially the Hunt is a much shorter cooldown because you get the reset when you play with Void Scarred hero talent. Now, the problem is that right now this isn't doing nearly as much damage, very simply, even though technically it does open you up to play with more buttons. You have an extra cooldown button, you have an extra rotational button. It's not doing nearly as much as your normal default Annihilator build that plays around this side of your talents. So it is a bit of a shame right now that you don't get to play around this, especially because logically, if I were to explain the spec, you were like, okay, so the spec is entirely around meta. It's entirely around entering meta and enabling Collapsing Star. So if you told me there is a hero talent which is entirely around entering meta, then the first thing I would guess is then this is the strongest hero talent, right? It's gonna have all of these buffs, all of these damage increases, even cooldown resets, even resets of entire cooldown buttons tied to this hero talent. So obviously it's gonna end up being the strongest one. At the moment, it's not. At the moment, the easiest one is to play the less regen version of Annihilator, where you don't take the extra regen of Void Ray, the extra regen of Fury from Reap, the second charge of Reap. Instead you take Sweet Suffering and both charges of your Void Ray damage. That's how the spec plays, and it's not that we can go in that much more depth around these buttons because the spec remains quite simple and quite straightforward. As for the reason why the spec is middling, besides just the numbers, of course, which can be tuned by Blizzard whenever, the middlingness comes from the fact that outside of your meta you are very weak. It takes you a long time of not even tank damage, less than tank damage, barely healer damage to actually ramp up to get to start your I-beam chains, especially in between pulls. If you don't have the Fury, your Consume does horrible damage. It's a single target ability, which is your filler. Even in AoE, even if there is 15 mobs, what you're using as a filler is a single target ability. So your damage craters heavily when you're not inside of meta. And even inside of meta, while your Consume gets empowered, becomes Devour, the only benefit you get by the empowered version of Consume is that it reduces the cooldown of Reap, which we have already established you don't need, because you're gonna be casting Reap just when Void Ray resets Reap's cooldown anyways. So it does have right now, mechanically, not in terms of numbers, but mechanically the weakness. The fact that you don't really have any kind of consistent filler AoE damage, and in between I-beams, in between Void Rays, you do have very little damage. When it comes to AoE, when it comes to just blanket AoE damage, it is very poor outside of your Metamorphosis windows. There aren't really that many tips or tricks around the spec. As I said, all of the tips around the spec outside of your cooldown is to build Fury as quickly as possible to then burn it with Void Beam, and inside of meta is to get to generate as many soul fragments as you can to have as many casts of your Mega Explosion Collapsing Star while keeping up your Fury without being drained out of your cooldown. At the moment the spec is a bit too bare of buttons, but at the moment, at the same time, it's also due to the fact that one of these buttons is there, actually two of them, including Throw Glaive, they're just not being used. There is one very good talent that would make the rotation make more sense, Devourer's Bite. Damage from Voidblade and the Hunt increases the damage to your target by 12% for 10 seconds, and this can stack. Which means that if you the Hunt into Voidblade, it's a 24% more damage for 10 seconds. It's just that it's a bit hard to reach. You are already pressed in buttons you want to take at the last bracket of talent, so you don't really have the reach to get this, to make Voidblade a usable button. because you get the damage boost and every time you click it. But I think this can be solved reasonably easily when playing this spec. It is clear, of course, by the amount of buttons you are seeing being pressed and being used, that Blizzard wasn't planning of creating a very complex type of spec. It's clearly trying to base its enjoyableness, its enjoyability on players enjoying this flow of getting to 100 Fury, because you get to use your Void Beams, getting faster and faster to 100 Fury in AoE, so you get to constantly BI beaming inside of big Mythic Plus packs, and then when you enter meta, the race against time of your draining Fury and trying to get as many casts of this huge ability, which also feels great because you know it's gonna crit, it's a guaranteed crit, it's gonna be a huge number. It's this duality of your playstyle in and out of your cooldown, which is going to draw players in, because it does feel satisfying to be successful at both. But you know, it is somewhat slightly a bit too devoid of buttons or complexity as a spec, so it's not going to be your type of spec if you were into these kind of more complex features like current live version, say Arcane Mage, for example. This is closer to something like a balanced druid kind of spec. I would say, though, it's still a pretty good, successful new spec. In terms of simplicity, as we mentioned, it's not that Demon Hunter is still in its old ways of Havoc being a brain-dead 2-button spec either, so it's not that they are releasing a copy of Havoc Demon Hunter either. So it's still pretty good, it's pretty nice, very good theme around Void damage, Void ability, Void spells, and while the rotation is very simple and straightforward, it does feel satisfying enough as you weave between the two styles in and out of your cooldowns. It would definitely be able to find appreciators amongst the community and the players for this flavor of a spec. So this is what we have for today, highlighting the new spec of the expansion in the Midnight's beta. As mentioned, perhaps surprisingly, not really an OP spec right now, not really some super high damage for the spec, but it is doing just fine, and the rotation, while simple, is definitely going to find players who find it satisfying to pull off overall. So with this being said and done with, we can now leave each other on this Tuesday it is. So with this out of the way, we are now saying our goodbyes, starting by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I think it is Tuesday, right? Yeah, even technically, we are at 2 AM, so we are in Tuesday.